Hi there, Frontline Church family. I'm back in my office for today's Moravian text reading, a little study on 1 Corinthians 15, verse 29 to 41, part of a bigger chapter around the resurrection. And not just Christ's resurrection, and not even just our resurrection as the resurrection of the saints, but actually the resurrection of all people into that new heaven, new earth, and that ultimate eternity in resurrected eternal bodies of heaven or hell. C.S. Lewis talking about this hinge point moment of resurrection of Christ. He described it as a little bit like a forced door being opened, busted open, death being defeated, and it creates a way through for all of us to live in resurrection life. And we read that yesterday, a first fruit, Christ the first fruit on the tree, and then we become resurrection people through that reality too. Today's reading starts with a really tricky idea, the baptism for the dead. Paul says to them, if there's no resurrection, then why do you baptize on behalf of those who've already died? And three things on that. First of all, I'm not sure anyone really knows what that verse means. Secondly, I think that the earliest church, these first believers, were so innovative in their practices, so adaptive in their practices, that many of the things they would have done would have died out over the years. The church is at its best when it innovates in a line of tradition. But the best explanation for the resurrection, for the baptism of those who have died, is in this context of heavy persecution, of martyrdom. There would have been new believers who confessed Jesus and then were martyred. And symbolically, it is suggested that other believers would have been baptized on their behalf to signify their baptism into Christ. And we simply don't know, but for me that idea fits because Paul actually goes on to almost slightly digress about his own suffering and facing wild beasts in Ephesus. So it perhaps connects into that idea of persecution. We then move, as I was saying, we then move into this idea around, I suppose, this link between morality and resurrection and eternity. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And it is great logic that Paul's using. Humans have this inbuilt moral driver. We might not all agree on morality, but as humans, we try to define morality and hold others accountable in that morality. And I suppose what Paul's saying is, well, if there's no resurrection, then there's no judgment, and if there's no judgment, there's no eternal reward or punishment. And I think as humans, we inherently know the importance of eternal reward or punishment. It's an intrinsic thing within us. So bad company corrupts good character. Paul's teaching on resurrection, but cannot resist applying it practically to how we live day to day. Then we move from verse 35 into this fantastic little section around a metaphor of understanding resurrection. Paul says, if you look at a plant, I don't know, a daffodil, that it wasn't a whole daffodil, green stem and yellow flower that was buried into the ground. It was a seed that was buried into ground, one type of flesh raised into another type of flesh. And that is what it is like with our resurrection. It was Jesus' resurrection. His body went into the ground, into the grave, as a mortal body, raised into life as an incorruptible body. That is exactly what will happen to us who die in Christ, raised into new life. And those who are alive when Jesus returns will be transformed as we see him into equally heaven-ready bodies fit for eternity. And Christ's resurrection models and guarantees our likewise resurrection. I've just got a little quote from the Pulitzer Prize winner John Updike, he wrote a little poem about this. He said, "Make no mistake," he's talking of Jesus, "if he rose at all, it was his body. If the cell's dissolution did not reverse, the molecules reknit, the amino acids rekindle, the church will fail." There has to be a physical bodily resurrection for Jesus, because without that, as we've read in the previous readings, our faith is futile. There is no victory over sin. There is no victory over the devil. There is no victory over death. But Christ indeed has been raised. The door has been booted open wide, and we, in the wake of that, can access and enter into resurrection life. We are being transformed, but when we see him face to face, we will be transformed into his likeness to share in his nature forever. This is the hope of the resurrection of the saints. It's incredibly good news.